My name is Alex Mason. I tell workplace revenge stories where betrayal sparks strategy, humiliation becomes a turning point, and justice arrives without shouting. These stories are about corporate power, toxic managers, silent endurance, and the moment someone decides they're done being treated like a target. Not with violence, not with chaos, with precision. This story is fictional and created for entertainment and self-reflection. It does not encourage harm, hate, or violence. It explores emotional justice and professional accountability through storytelling. Today's story. My boss humiliated me in the meeting. 90 days later, he reported to me. Let me take you back to the day it started. I still remember the exact second the room turned on me. The conference table was polished enough to reflect the ceiling lights and the faces of people pretending not to enjoy what was happening. 12 employees, 2 interns, 1 HR representative writing notes like this was routine. And at the head of the table sat Greg Halden, my manager, leaning back like a man who believed embarrassment was a leadership skill. He clicked his pen twice and said, loud enough for the hallway to hear, "Alex, this is why you're not leadership material. You're too slow, too cautious, too average." A few people laughed, not because it was funny, because laughing is what people do when they want to stay safe. Greg tapped the screen behind him. My forecast model was projected for everyone to see. He zoomed in on a line item, circled it in red, and said, "Who taught you to model revenue like this? A YouTube course?" More laughter. Softer this time. Nervous. Greg leaned forward and lowered his voice, the way bullies do when they want their cruelty to feel intimate. "I asked for a forecast. You gave me a bedtime story." I could have defended myself in that moment. I had evidence. Emails, a paper trail showing he demanded the exact assumptions on the screen. But corporate reality has its own rules. Being right doesn't always protect you. Sometimes it just paints a target on your back. So I kept my face neutral, lowered my chin slightly, and said the one sentence that made him relax. "Understood. I'll fix it." Greg smiled. He thought he broke me. He didn't realize I'd just started calculating the room, the power lines, and the exits. Because 90 days later, Greg Halden was sitting across from me in a smaller conference room, sweating through his collar, asking if I could help him transition. And I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I slid a folder across the table and said, "Of course. Let's start with the paperwork." The company was called Armitage Solutions. From the outside, it looked modern. Glass lobby, curated plants that never died, a wall with the company values in brushed steel letters. From the inside, it was an ecosystem built on pressure and fear. Armitage sold enterprise logistics software, multi-year contracts, complicated implementations, big promises. The revenue was real. So were the egos. I was a senior analyst in the strategy team, not entry-level, not executive. The kind of position where you touch everything, but own nothing. You see the truth, but you don't get to decide what leadership does with it. My first month at Armitage, I noticed something that explained everything. People didn't get promoted for excellence. They got promoted for obedience. Greg Halden was the purest example. He was Director of Revenue Operations, which meant he had access to everyone's performance metrics, commissions, forecasts, and failures. He loved that power more than the job itself. Greg didn't correct you privately. He performed correction publicly. He didn't give feedback. He delivered humiliation with witnesses. And the worst part? Leadership liked him. Because Greg delivered the one thing executives crave more than truth: certainty, even if he had to manufacture it. If reality didn't match his numbers, he didn't adjust the numbers. He blamed reality. Sales blamed delivery. Delivery blamed engineering. Engineering blamed product. Product blamed changing requirements. Greg blamed whoever couldn't defend themselves in the room. And if you challenged him, he did something even more dangerous than yelling. He quietly damaged your reputation. Your name stopped showing up on key meetings. Your calendar stopped getting invites. You stopped getting opportunities that just happened to go to someone else. No one called it retaliation. They called it alignment. The humiliation meeting wasn't random. It was scheduled like an event. Greg chose the biggest room. He invited people who didn't need to be there. He even asked the operations coordinator to record the session for documentation. I didn't understand why at first.
Then I learned about the client, Varelli Freight.
Varelli was a logistics company big enough to change our entire year. A contract worth $10 million across 3 years. If we won it, leadership would celebrate. If we lost it, someone would become a scapegoat. Greg wanted to lead the pitch, but he needed my forecast model because strategy owned the pricing assumptions and adoption timeline. I built a model based on real implementation constraints, conservative assumptions, realistic adoption, and a risk-adjusted ramp. Varelli was notorious for moving slowly. Greg wanted something else. He wanted numbers that made him look like a visionary. 3 days before the meeting, he called me into his office. He shut the door and leaned forward. "Alex," he said, "your forecast is boring." "It's accurate," I replied. Greg smiled like I'd said something innocent. Accurate is what losers say when they don't know how to win. I need aggressive. I need a curve that tells leadership we're unstoppable. I explained the risks: churn rates, integration delays, adoption patterns from similar accounts. Greg nodded politely, then said, "Great, so we'll ignore that." I asked him for confirmation in writing, carefully, respectfully, not to fight, just to protect my work. He waved his hand. "Don't be dramatic. Make the changes." So I did what employees do when survival matters. I sent an email summarizing his requested assumptions. I attached the original model and the revised model. And I wrote one sentence that would matter later. "Per your direction, I have updated the forecast assumptions to reflect an aggressive adoption timeline." Greg replied, "Looks good." 3 words. Then came the meeting. Greg projected the revised model, my file name, my department, my signature formatting, and he used it to publicly destroy me. He mocked my intelligence, my competence, my future. He did it while displaying the numbers he demanded. When he finished, he looked around the room like he'd delivered a master class. "Any questions?" Silence. Then my colleague, Nina, raised her hand. Not to defend me, to protect herself. "Greg, do you want Alex to redo the entire model?" Greg's eyes flicked to me. "Oh, he will," Greg said. "He'll redo it until it's good enough." He looked at HR. "Put that in the notes." HR wrote it down. And Greg added the final sentence, the one designed to define me in front of witnesses. "If you can't handle pressure, Alex, you should reconsider whether you belong here." That's the trick of humiliation. It doesn't just hurt, It tries to rewrite your identity in front of an audience. And if you react emotionally, the story becomes, you were weak. So I stood, nodded, and said, "Understood. I'll fix it." Greg smiled, satisfied. The meeting ended. People filed out. Nina passed me and whispered, "I'm sorry," without looking me in the eyes. Her apology didn't change the truth. Nobody stopped him. And that meant the system would keep rewarding him, unless someone rewired it. That night, I didn't go home. I walked to a quiet bar 2 blocks away. Dim lights, empty booths, the kind of place where you can think without being observed. I sat with a notebook and a glass of water, not to drink, to decide. The question every burned-out employee eventually asks is simple. Do I quit? Quitting would have been easy. I had skills, a resume, options. But quitting would have given Greg exactly what he wanted. Proof that his methods worked. And I realized something else that night, something painfully clear. Greg didn't hate me because I was weak. Greg targeted me because I was careful. Because careful people keep receipts. Because careful people don't speak impulsively. Because careful people, if pushed far enough, become dangerous in the most professional way possible. So I made a decision. I wouldn't fight loudly. I wouldn't demand respect from people who enjoyed disrespecting others. I would simply build a position so strong that Greg couldn't touch it. And if he tried, he'd be the one standing in front of witnesses, explaining himself. I opened my notebook and wrote 3 words: document, leverage, timing. Then I added a 4th, patience. The next morning, I went into the office early. I didn't confront Greg. I didn't complain. I did something more effective. I stopped being helpful. In toxic companies, being helpful becomes a trap. You solve problems you didn't create for leaders who take credit while they slowly normalize your exhaustion. So I changed how I worked. Every request from Greg now required clarity. What exactly do you want? By when? And who will approve it? And every answer I gave was documented, politely, professionally, and in writing. If Greg tried to corner me verbally, I would respond with calm precision. Happy to. Can you send that request over email so I align with your expectations? It drove him insane. Because Greg thrived in ambiguity, the kind that lets him rewrite history later. I removed that oxygen.
People think corporate power is the person who yells the loudest. It rarely is. Real power is quiet. It's the person who controls risk, the person who understands cash, the person who can pause a deal with 1 sentence. At Armitage, that person wasn't Greg. It was Mara Ellison, our CFO. Mara didn't attend Greg's humiliation meeting. She had bigger priorities. But she received the same forecast package afterward, because finance always does. And finance always notices when numbers don't make sense. So I requested 15 minutes on Mara's calendar with a careful subject line: Virelli forecast assumptions, risk notes. I didn't accuse Greg. I didn't complain. I simply showed Mara 2 models, the original, conservative version, and the revised, aggressive version. Then I showed her the email where Greg approved the changes. And I said 1 sentence: I want to make sure finance is aware of the risk exposure if leadership uses this revised forecast externally. Mara studied the screen. No emotion, just focus. Then she asked, "Who requested the change?" I answered calmly, "Greg." Mara nodded once.
Send me both versions and the email chain. I sent it, immediately. And for the first time since the humiliation, I felt something shift, quietly. Not revenge, leverage. Once I shifted my focus from emotion to structure, I began seeing Greg's behavior differently. It wasn't random cruelty. It was a system. Greg would inflate forecasts at the start of a quarter to impress leadership. Then he'd apply pressure downstream so teams scrambled to make the illusion real. Then he'd blame other departments when reality refused to cooperate. He did the same thing with commissions. Sales reps would complain quietly that their numbers were adjusted. Quotas would change mid-quarter. Targets would move like they were on wheels. No one challenged him because everyone was afraid of being labeled not a team player. But fear doesn't erase data. And the more I looked, the more I saw that Greg wasn't just toxic. He was careless. Careless people leave trails. 2 weeks after my meeting with Mara, something happened. An internal audit request went out. Not company-wide, targeted. Revenue operations, forecasting, commission adjustments. The message was polite, neutral, and terrifying. Finance is conducting a standard review of revenue recognition assumptions and forecast methodologies ahead of Q2 guidance. In toxic workplaces, standard review means someone is bleeding internally and trying to act normal. Greg started walking faster. He began calling last-minute meetings. He demanded everyone recheck dashboards and clean up narrative. He tried to act calm, but his calm was performance. And I knew what he was really doing. He was trying to erase fingerprints. But you can't erase what already reached finance. Greg could have survived an audit if he stayed quiet. Instead, he panicked. He pulled me into a conference room and shut the door. His voice was controlled, but his eyes weren't. "Alex," he said, "finance is asking questions. They're misreading the forecast. We need to get ahead of this." I kept my tone neutral. "What do you need?" Greg hesitated, then said, "I need you to confirm in writing that the aggressive assumptions were your recommendation, just to align narrative." There it was. The confession disguised as alignment. He wanted me to rewrite the paper trail. He wanted me to become his shield. I looked at him for a second and let silence do work. Then I said, calmly, "I can't do that." Greg's jaw tightened. "Why not?" "Because it wasn't my recommendation," I replied. "And finance already has the email chain." He stared at me, and in that moment I saw the truth behind his confidence. Greg didn't believe he was untouchable. He was just used to people being afraid. He leaned closer. "You think you're smarter than me?" "No," I said. "I think you're more exposed than you realize." Greg's face hardened. "Be careful," he warned. I nodded. "I am." And I walked out. Here's what Greg didn't know. Armitage wasn't just chasing Varelli freight. Armitage was being watched. Quietly. By private equity. Northmark Capital had been circling Armitage for months, interested in acquiring the company, if the revenue was clean enough to justify the price. Mara, the CFO, knew this. And when an acquisition is being considered, financial integrity stops being a preference. It becomes a weapon. Forecast manipulation that leadership once tolerated suddenly becomes a threat that can kill a deal. And when a deal is at stake, the company doesn't protect the loudest person. It protects the future. Mara scheduled a meeting with 2 executives and a representative from Northmark's diligence team. I was invited, not because I was important socially, but because I had something rare: documentation and credibility.
In that meeting, I didn't attack Greg. I didn't rant. I did what professionals do when the room finally wants truth. I laid out the risks. I showed variance between forecast assumptions and actual adoption patterns. I shared the email chain, proving how pressure flowed from leadership into the model. Northmark didn't react emotionally. They reacted strategically. Because to them, Greg wasn't a manager. He was a liability. In the weeks that followed, the company's atmosphere changed. Not with announcements, with behavior. Greg stopped being invited to certain meetings. He started sending more emails, trying to create evidence that he was involved. He over-explained, over-justified. People like Greg can sense when the air is changing. They just don't know where the storm will hit. Then, 75 days after the humiliation meeting, Armitage announced a strategic realignment. New reporting lines, new oversight for revenue operations, new controls on forecasting and commissions, and a new role: Director of Strategic Revenue Integrity. That was the official title. Everyone called it something else. The person who makes sure Greg can't lie anymore. Mara offered me the role. I accepted. Not because I wanted power, because I wanted structure that protected people like me from people like him. 90 days after Greg humiliated me, he received a calendar invite. No subject line drama, no emotional language, just transition meeting, revenue operations reporting update. He walked into a smaller conference room. No audience, no interns, no HR note-taking show. Just him, me, and Mara. Greg sat down and tried to smile like nothing had happened. "Alex," he said, "congratulations. I always knew you had potential." I didn't react. Mara spoke first. "Greg, effective immediately, revenue operations will report into Alex's new function. Forecast approvals and commission adjustments will require dual sign-off." Greg blinked. He tried to laugh. "Okay, so what exactly is Alex doing now?" Mara's voice stayed calm. "He's ensuring compliance, integrity, and accuracy in revenue reporting. You'll be working closely with him." Greg turned toward me, his smile tightening. "So, I report to you?" I met his eyes and kept my tone level. "Yes." And for the first time, Greg didn't have an audience to perform for. No laughter, no nervous supporters. Just silence. Greg cleared his throat. "Fine," he said. "Let's make this smooth." I nodded and slid a folder across the table. "Of course," I said. "Let's start with the paperwork." Greg opened the folder. Inside were new processes, new controls, and audit documentation. But on top, clean and impossible to ignore, was the email chain. The one where he demanded aggressive assumptions. The one where he approved them. His fingerprints, his signature. Greg's face changed slightly as he read. Not anger, recognition. He realized the humiliation meeting wasn't forgotten. It was archived. He looked up slowly. "You kept this." I didn't smile. "I organized it," I said. Mara stood. "This isn't personal, Greg," she said. "It's business." Greg swallowed.
And I added one sentence, the sentence he used on me, now rewritten with calm precision. If you can't handle pressure, Greg, you should reconsider whether you belong here. Greg stared at me, stunned. Not because I raised my voice, because I didn't. I gave him the same lesson he tried to teach me, without cruelty, without spectacle, and without fear. Greg didn't get fired that day. That would have been cinematic. Real corporate consequences are quieter. Greg lost access to systems. His approvals were restricted. His adjustments required oversight. His narrative control disappeared. And without narrative control, Greg had nothing. Within 3 weeks, the audit discovered irregularities in commission adjustments and forecast reporting, patterns that couldn't be explained as miscommunication. Greg was given a choice: resign quietly with a neutral reference, or stay and face a formal compliance process that would follow him. He resigned. His farewell message was short and overly positive. Grateful for the journey, excited for my next chapter. No one replied with anything meaningful. Because people didn't miss him. They missed the version of the workplace they could finally breathe in. One afternoon, Nina approached my desk. She looked nervous. "Hey," she said, "I heard Greg's gone." I nodded. Nina hesitated. "I should have spoken up in that meeting," she said. "I didn't. And I'm sorry."
I studied her face for a second, then said the truth. "I understand why you didn't." Nina blinked.
"You do?"
"Yes," I said. "But I also hope you learned something." She nodded.
"I did."
"Good," I replied. "Because next time, you might be the only person who can stop it for someone else." Nina swallowed and said quietly,
"I will."
And that was the real ending. Not Greg leaving, not me winning, but the workplace changing, because the system finally punished the behavior it used to reward. Here's what this story is really about. Some people mistake fear for respect. They build power by humiliating others, and they believe no one will ever push back, because pushing back looks risky. But quiet professionals do something dangerous. They document. They build leverage. They wait for timing. They let the system catch up to the truth. When everything is taken from you at work, your dignity, your peace, your voice, your revenge doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes the best revenge is becoming untouchable. And sometimes it's watching the person who broke you ask you for permission to leave. If this story hit close to home, tell me in the comments. What's the worst workplace humiliation you've ever witnessed or survived? And would you play it loud or silent? Subscribe to Alex Mason for more stories like this. New episodes every week. And if you want a part 2 from Nina's perspective, type Part 2 below.